The bank account had $840,000 in it on Monday morning. By Friday afternoon, it had $11. My wife hadn't gambled it away. She hadn't been scammed. She had wired every single cent to a man she'd been secretly involved with for over a year. A man who convinced her I was worth more dead to my own company than alive, and who very nearly turned out to be right. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that the same week she left me with $11 to my name, a man most of the city crossed the street to avoid would sit across from me in an empty restaurant after closing and say something that would turn $11 into an empire. Everything she took from you, he said, was never really yours to begin with. It was just the down payment on who you were about to become. Stay with me until the end of this one, because the way this story actually ends is not the ending you're expecting, and the biggest twist doesn't happen where you think it will. Let's start from the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how far the fall was before you can understand exactly how high the climb became. My name isn't important right now. What matters is that 14 years ago, I built a mid-sized commercial construction and property development company from a single rented backhoe and a business loan my own father co-signed against his better judgment. For over a decade, that company grew steadily. We built strip malls, office parks, a handful of mid-rise residential buildings, the unglamorous backbone of a growing city that nobody notices until it isn't there. By year 12, the company was worth just under $9 million on paper, employed 41 people directly, and had never once missed a payroll. I tell you all of that not to impress you, but so you understand something important. This isn't a story about a man who failed. This is a story about a man who succeeded, who built something real and solid and worth protecting, and who still lost almost everything anyway, because the danger to everything you build rarely comes from the market, or the economy, or your competitors. It comes from the people closest to you, the ones who already have a key to every door you own. My wife's name was Elena. We'd been married 11 years when everything came apart. For most of that marriage, I believed we were building something together, a life, a family, a shared future neither of us had to face alone. Looking back now, I understand that belief was only ever half true. I was building. She was watching, calculating, waiting for the exact right moment to convert everything I built into something she could take with her. Here's something most people never realize about betrayal. It rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small, deniable pieces spread out over months, sometimes years, each piece small enough to explain away, until one day you look back and realize the pattern was there the entire time, and you simply chose not to see it. The first piece was a business trip to Denver that ran 2 days longer than it needed to. The second piece was a new phone she said was for work, one she kept face down on every surface in our house. The third piece, the one I should have paid the most attention to, was a sudden, unexplained interest in the specific structure of our joint accounts, the ones that required both signatures, and the ones that only required hers. I want to ask you something right now, because I've asked myself this question 1,000 times since. How many warning signs have to appear before trust finally breaks? For most of us, the answer is far higher than it should be, because trust doesn't want to break. Trust fights to survive, even against evidence that should have killed it months earlier. There was a night, about 3 months before everything came apart, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from that entire year. I woke up around 2 in the morning and found Elena's side of the bed empty. I found her downstairs in the kitchen, sitting in the dark, her phone face down on the counter exactly the way she always kept it, and when I asked if she was okay, she told me she couldn't sleep, that work had been stressful, that it was nothing. I remember standing there in the doorway, half awake, feeling something in my chest that I couldn't name yet, a small, quiet alarm bell that most people learn to silence long before they learn to listen to it. I asked her directly that night, gently, whether something was wrong between us. She looked at me for a long moment, longer than the question required, and then she smiled and said everything was fine, that I was imagining things, that I'd always been the type to worry too much about nothing. I believed her, or at least I told myself I believed her, because believing her was easier than confronting a possibility I wasn't ready to face. Most people never realize how often we choose comfortable ignorance over uncomfortable truth, not because we're foolish, but because the alternative feels too large to hold. Looking back now, I understand that night in the kitchen was the moment the entire scheme very nearly unraveled 3 months early. Elena told me herself, much later, that she had been on the phone with Victor when I woke up, finalizing the exact account restructuring that would eventually consolidate our reserves into a single signature. If I had pushed harder that night, if I had picked up that phone sitting face down on the counter instead of walking back upstairs, an entire company, an entire marriage, an entire future might have taken a completely different shape. I share that memory because it matters for anyone watching this who currently feels that same small, quiet alarm bell somewhere in their own life right now. That instinct, the one you're tempted to silence because acknowledging it feels too disruptive, too inconvenient, too frightening, is very rarely wrong. It exists for a reason. Most people don't miss the signs of betrayal because the signs weren't there. They miss them because some part of them made a quiet, unconscious decision that not seeing them was safer than seeing them clearly. The man's name, I would later learn, was Victor Reyes. He wasn't a stranger to me. That's the part of this story that still makes my stomach turn every time I tell it. Victor Reyes was my company's chief financial officer, a man I had personally hired 6 years earlier, a man who had sat at my dinner table more times than I could count, a man who knew the exact banking structure of my company down to the last routing number, because I had trusted him with all of it. Victor and Elena had been having an affair for just over 14 months. But an affair, painful as it is, wasn't actually the plan. The affair was simply the tool that made the real plan possible. Here's where it gets interesting. And here's where you need to lean in close. Because the scheme they built together was far more calculated than simple jealousy or greed ever could have produced alone. Victor had spent months quietly restructuring several of our company's investment accounts, moving cash reserves into instruments that looked, on paper, like standard treasury management, the kind of financial housekeeping any growing construction company does regularly. What those transfers actually did was consolidate nearly $840,000 of liquid company reserves into 2 accounts that required only a single signature to move. Mine, and through a joint personal guarantee I had signed years earlier during a difficult refinancing period, Elena's. I signed that guarantee back when our marriage was strong, back when giving her financial access felt like an act of partnership rather than a loaded weapon left sitting in a drawer. Most people never realize how many decisions made during the good years of a relationship become the exact vulnerabilities exploited during the bad ones. The plan itself was almost elegant in its cruelty. Victor would resign from the company quietly, claiming a family health emergency out of state. Elena would wait exactly 1 week after his departure, long enough to avoid suspicion, and then wire the entire consolidated reserve to an account Victor had already opened under a shell corporation in another state. By the time I discovered the missing funds, both of them would already be gone, together, with enough capital to start an entirely new life somewhere I would never think to look. What they didn't plan for was timing. What they didn't plan for was me coming home 4 hours early from a site inspection on the exact Friday afternoon the wire transfer cleared, walking into my own home office to grab a folder I'd forgotten, and finding my wife sitting at my desk, my laptop open, a wire confirmation email still glowing on the screen. I want you to imagine that moment with me, because words don't fully capture what it feels like to watch someone's face change in real time from shock to calculation, to something that almost looked like relief, the relief of someone who has been dreading a confrontation for so long that its actual arrival feels almost like release. She didn't deny it. That's the part that still surprises people when I tell this story. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't pretend confusion. She looked at me and said, calmly, almost gently, "You were always going to lose this company eventually. The market was already turning. I just made sure something was saved before it all collapsed. Think about that sentence for a moment, because it reveals something most people never realize about the psychology of betrayal at this level. She wasn't just stealing money. She had built an entire justification in her mind, a story where she was the responsible one, the practical one, protecting value from a husband too naive to see the collapse coming. Betrayal almost always wears the costume of practicality. Almost nobody who destroys someone else's life believes they're the villain of their own story. I asked her the only question that mattered in that moment. Where was the money? She told me the truth, oddly enough, maybe because there was nothing left to protect by lying. Already wired. Already gone. Already sitting in an account neither Victor nor his lawyer would ever willingly let me trace. Within 72 hours, my accountant confirmed the full damage. $840,000 of company reserves, gone. Combined with existing project loans and payroll obligations already committed for the following 2 weeks, my company's actual liquid cash position stood at $11. $11, after 14 years of building something real. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because most people never realize just how thin the line is between a stable, thriving business and complete collapse. It isn't distance. It's a signature. One signature, from one person you trusted completely, and 14 years of steady growth can disappear in the time it takes a wire transfer to clear. I had to make calls that week I never imagined making. Calls to 41 employees explaining a payroll delay I couldn't yet explain the reason for. Calls to subcontractors on 3 active job sites, asking for patience I had no real ability to promise. Calls to my own father, the man who had co-signed that very first loan 14 years earlier, listening to his voice crack with a mixture of anger and heartbreak that hurt worse than anything Elena had done to me directly. One of those calls, more than any other, still stays with me. A site foreman named Marcus Delaney had worked for my company for almost the entire 14 years I'd been in business. One of the first 3 people I ever hired back when the company was nothing but a rented backhoe and a stack of unpaid invoices. Marcus had a daughter starting her first year of college that same month, tuition due in 11 days. Tuition he'd been counting on his paycheck to cover. I called him personally because I owed him that much honesty, and I told him the truth, or as much of the truth as I understood at that point. Company funds had been compromised. Payroll would be delayed, possibly by weeks, possibly longer, and I genuinely didn't know yet how bad the damage actually was. I expected anger. I expected him to tell me he was done, that 14 years of loyalty didn't cover a gap this large, that he had a daughter whose future couldn't wait on my crisis to resolve itself. Instead, Marcus was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said something that still humbles me every time I think about it. "You've never missed a payroll in 14 years, he said. Not once, not even the year the recession nearly took everyone else in this industry down with it. I'll figure out the tuition. You figure out whatever happened. I trust you enough to give you that time." He didn't know yet about Elena, or Victor, or the wire transfer. He simply knew 14 years of my track record, and he chose to extend the same trust one had spent 14 years earning, at the exact moment my own wife had chosen to destroy it completely. I think about the contrast between those 2 people constantly. Elena had access to everything, my accounts, my home, my daily life, and she used that access to take everything she could carry. Marcus had access to nothing but 14 years of consistent behavior, and he chose to extend trust based purely on that pattern, without needing anything else to justify it. It taught me something I hadn't fully understood before that week. Real trust was never actually built on access, or intimacy, or proximity. It was built on pattern, on the accumulation of small, honest moments repeated so consistently over time that people can rely on them even in the dark, even without full information, even when everything else around them is falling apart. But here's where the story takes its first real turn, the one that most people watching this could never predict. One of my company's longtime subcontractors, a concrete supplier named Dario, showed up at my office uninvited the following Tuesday. Dario had worked with my company for nearly a decade. Quiet man. Reliable. The kind of man who does his job well and says almost nothing beyond what the job requires. He sat down across from my desk, the same desk Elena had been sitting at exactly 1 week earlier, and said something I never expected to hear from him. "I heard what happened," he said. "I know someone who might be able to help. But I need you to understand something before I make that call. The man I'm thinking of doesn't help people out of kindness. He helps people because he sees value in them. If he decides you have that value, your life changes completely. If he decides you don't, this conversation never happened, and you'll never hear from either of us again." I asked him who he was talking about. Dario said a single name, quietly, the way people say names they've learned to respect and fear in equal measure. Salvatore Marchetti. I want you to remember that name, because it's the second half of this entire story. Even before Dario explained anything further, I recognized the name from years of working in commercial construction in this city. Salvatore Marchetti's name moved through industry circles the way certain names always do, spoken carefully, attached to warnings, attached to rumors of a real estate and development empire that stretched across half the region, an empire built, according to whispers I'd heard for over a decade, on foundations that went far beyond standard commercial financing. Officially, Marchetti Holdings owned shopping centers, mixed-use developments, warehouse complexes, and one of the largest private commercial land banks in the state. Unofficially, the same rumors that followed men like this everywhere described a very different kind of foundation. Rumors of competitors who suddenly sold their land at steep discounts under circumstances nobody discussed openly. Rumors of union disputes resolved through channels that never touched a courtroom. Rumors of a man who built his kingdom, quite literally, from the ground up, brick by brick, favor by favor, debt by debt, until half the skyline of this city owed something to him, whether they admitted it publicly or not. Dario made the call that same afternoon. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a restaurant that had already closed for the night. Every chair upside down on every table except the one where a man I'd never met sat waiting for me. A single glass of red wine untouched in front of him. Salvatore Marchetti looked nothing like the rumors had prepared me for. Not a large man. Not a loud man. A man somewhere in his early 60s with silver hair combed back neatly, wearing a suit that looked expensive without looking flashy, the kind of quiet expense that only people who've had money for a very long time actually understand. His eyes were the thing I noticed most. Calm, patient, and unmistakably sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent decades reading people faster than they could ever hope to hide from him. "Sit," he said, before I'd even fully crossed the room. I sat. For nearly an hour, he asked me questions no bank, no lawyer, and certainly no family member had asked me in the entire nightmare week since Elena's betrayal. He didn't ask how much money I needed. He asked how the betrayal had happened, in exact detail, every signature, every account, every piece of trust one had extended over the years that eventually became the exact weapon used against me. I answered everything honestly, mostly because I had nothing left to protect. What did I have to lose, sitting in an empty restaurant at midnight with $11 to my name? When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly without drinking from it. Then he said something I would turn over in my mind for weeks afterward. "Betrayal like this," he said, "only works on men who've never been tested. You've been tested now. That makes you far more valuable than you were a week ago, whether you can see that yet or not." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. He asked about my company's operations in detail, the actual construction side, not the finances Victor had gutted. He asked about my project management systems, my subcontractor relationships, my crew retention rate, my safety record across 14 years of active job sites. And here's where it gets interesting. He wasn't asking like a man deciding whether to lend me money. He was asking like a man conducting an audit of a company he was already considering acquiring, or absorbing, or something in between that I didn't yet have a name for. Then he asked me something I hadn't expected. He asked me to describe Victor, not professionally, but personally. What kind of man was he at dinner parties? How did he treat waitstaff at restaurants? How did he speak about other people when he assumed no one important was listening? I answered as honestly as I could, describing a man who had always been polished, charming, endlessly capable of making everyone in a room feel like the most important person in it, right up until the moment he no longer needed them to feel that way. Salvatore nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he already suspected. Most people believe con artists succeed because they're excellent liars, he said. That's not usually true. The best ones succeed because they're excellent at making you feel seen, understood, valued, in exactly the specific way you were hungry to feel seen. The lie isn't the dangerous part. The attention is the dangerous part. People rarely get betrayed by strangers who deceive them. They get betrayed by people who studied exactly what they needed to hear, and then said it perfectly, for as long as it took to gain access to what they actually wanted. I asked him how a man builds real protection against something like that, something that doesn't announce itself as a threat, something that arrives disguised as exactly the kind of attention and warmth every person craves from the people closest to them. His answer was simple, and I've carried it with me every day since. You stop needing anyone to make you feel valuable, he said. The moment your sense of worth depends on someone else's attention, you become an easy target for anyone skilled enough to control that attention. The men and women who get exploited most completely are almost never the foolish ones. They're the ones starving for something they should have learned to give themselves. I want you to sit with that idea for a moment, because it applies to almost everyone watching this video, whether or not you've ever faced betrayal on the scale I'm describing. Most people never realize that the specific hunger inside them, for approval, for attention, for someone to finally see them the way they've always wanted to be seen, is exactly the hunger predators learn to identify and exploit first. It isn't weakness to have that hunger. Every human being has some version of it. But learning to recognize it in yourself, and learning to meet at least part of that need on your own, is one of the strongest forms of protection anyone can build, far stronger than any lock, any contract, any joint account requiring 2 signatures instead of 1. Your wife took $840,000, he said eventually. That's a real loss, and I understand why it feels like the end of everything you built. But I want you to consider something most men in your position never consider in the moment. That money was never the actual value of your company. The value of your company is 14 years of relationships, systems, and reputation that no wire transfer can touch, because those things were never sitting in an account for anyone to steal. He offered me something that night I still find difficult to fully explain to people who weren't in that restaurant with us. Not a loan, not an investment in the traditional sense. He offered to absorb my company's operational side into his own development empire, covering the immediate cash crisis entirely, restructuring the debt Victor's scheme had left behind, and installing me as managing partner over an expanded construction division that would oversee every physical build across his entire portfolio. Why me? I asked him, the only question that mattered. His answer stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this entire story. Because most men who lose everything spend the next year explaining what happened to them. You've spent this entire conversation explaining what you learned instead. That distinction, he said, is the only thing that has ever separated the men I build empires with from the men I simply feel sorry for. But before you assume I said yes immediately, you need to understand something important about this story. Something that separates it from the kind of fantasy where a stranger simply hands a broken man everything he ever wanted. I asked Salvatore Marchetti the same hard question I suspect any careful person would ask, sitting across from a man whose empire was rumored to be built on foundations far outside the reach of ordinary law. What exactly would I be agreeing to? I asked him directly. Not the construction division. The rest of it. What is this company really? He didn't flinch, and he didn't deflect. which itself told me something important about the kind of man I was dealing with. The construction and development division you'd be running is completely legitimate, he said. Every contract real. Every payroll real. Every building actually built, actually inspected, actually sold or leased to real tenants. What happens in other corners of my business, corners I built decades before you and I ever sat down together, is not something I will ask you to be part of, and not something I'll explain to you unless you go looking for answers you don't need. The wall between those two worlds is one I built myself a long time ago, and it has held for over 30 years because I've never once asked a legitimate employee to cross it. I asked for a week to think about it, the same instinct that had once saved me from making a decision out of pure desperation. He granted it without hesitation. The same patience I would later learn was one of his defining traits, the patience of a genuinely powerful man who never needed anyone's immediate agreement to feel secure in his own position. I spent that week doing something I should have done with Elena's finances years earlier. I actually verified everything. I spoke, carefully, to two other contractors who had worked adjacent to Marchetti Holdings over the years. What I learned matched the rumors almost exactly. A construction empire responsible for some of the most significant commercial development in the region over 3 decades. A reputation for paying subcontractors on time and in full even during economic downturns that bankrupted competitors, and beneath all of it, an undeniable current of fear that ran through every conversation anyone had about crossing the man at the center of it. One contractor, a man who had built alongside Marchetti's company for over 20 years, told me something I still think about regularly. Marchetti doesn't hurt people who build honestly for him, he said. He hurts people who steal from him, or people who think they can lie to his face. If you're straight with that man, he'll build you something bigger than you ever imagined for yourself. I want to ask you something, the exact question I sat with that entire week. If the very worst moment of your life, the moment someone you loved completely stole everything you'd built, suddenly opened a door to something larger than you'd ever imagined possible, but that door came wrapped in risk you couldn't fully calculate or control, would you walk through it? I chose to walk through it. But I chose it with my eyes fully open, the same way I'd learned, far too late, that I should have kept my eyes open with Elena for years before that Friday afternoon. I called Salvatore back exactly 1 week later and accepted, on one condition, the same instinct that had protected me during that first conversation. I told him I needed absolute clarity, documented clarity, about exactly where the legitimate construction division ended and everything else began. He was quiet for a moment on the phone, and then he laughed, a short, genuinely warm sound that surprised me. A man who negotiates his boundaries before accepting a gift, he said, is exactly the kind of man who deserves to be handed something real. Within 30 days, Marchetti Holdings had absorbed my company's operational division entirely, restructured the debt Victor's scheme had created, and covered the immediate payroll crisis that had kept me awake for 3 consecutive weeks. My 41 employees kept their jobs. Every active project continued without a single missed deadline. And I was installed as managing partner over a construction division suddenly responsible for projects across an entire region, not just the modest footprint I had spent 14 years slowly building alone. But here's the biggest lesson buried inside the middle of this story, the one I want you to sit with for a moment before we continue. The empire I eventually inherited wasn't handed to me because Salvatore Marchetti felt sorry for a man his wife had betrayed. It was handed to me because betrayal had already tested something in me that comfort never could have tested. Most men never discover what they're actually made of until everything comfortable is stripped away. I discovered mine in an empty restaurant at midnight, with $11 to my name, sitting across from a man the entire city was afraid of. My first 90 days working under Salvatore's construction division taught me more about leadership and scale than my previous 14 years combined. He ran the legitimate side of his empire with a level of discipline that shocked me, given everything I'd heard about the rest of his world. Weekly project reviews across every active site. Zero tolerance for safety shortcuts, a policy he enforced more strictly than any government regulator ever had. Complete financial transparency across every legitimate division. Audited quarterly by an outside firm, he paid handsomely specifically because he wanted no ambiguity about where his clean money lived. I asked him once, several months into the role, why he ran his legitimate businesses with such rigid, almost obsessive precision, when rumors about the rest of his world painted such a different picture. His answer has stayed with me every day since. The legitimate side of an empire is the only part that outlives the man who built it, he said. Everything else, every shortcut, every shadow, dies with the reputation that created it. I've buried too many men who built their entire legacy on foundations that couldn't survive them. I decided decades ago that whatever else I was, I would leave behind something that didn't require fear to keep standing. Looking back now, I can see clearly the specific structural mistakes that made my original company so vulnerable to exactly what Victor and Elena did. Mistakes I see repeated constantly by business owners who reach out to me for advice today. The first mistake is granting single-signature access to significant reserves as a matter of convenience rather than treating dual authorization as a permanent structural requirement, even inside a marriage, even with people you trust completely. Convenience and vulnerability are almost always the same decision wearing different names. The second mistake is consolidating reserves into a small number of large accounts rather than spreading liquidity across multiple, harder-to-access instruments. Victor's entire scheme depended on the fact that $840,000 could be moved in a single transaction. A more fragmented structure, one requiring multiple separate approvals across multiple separate accounts, would have made a scheme like this significantly harder to execute quietly, and significantly more likely to be caught before it ever fully completed. The third mistake, and the one I think about the most, is failing to build any system of financial transparency between spouses that didn't rely purely on trust and nothing else. I want to be careful here, because I'm not suggesting suspicion should replace intimacy in a marriage, but a regular, structured habit of reviewing significant financial decisions together, not as an accusation, but as a shared practice, creates a kind of visibility that makes large-scale betrayal far harder to execute in silence. Secrecy is the oxygen betrayal breathes. Remove the secrecy, and most schemes like Victor's simply can't survive long enough to reach completion. Salvatore's own financial systems, I noticed within my first few weeks working under him, were built around exactly this principle. No single person, not even senior executives who had been with him for 20 years, held unilateral authority over reserves above a certain threshold. Every major transfer required at least 2 independent approvals from people who had no direct relationship with each other outside the company. It wasn't paranoia. It was architecture, built by a man who understood, probably from painful experience I never asked him to explain, that trust without structure eventually becomes an invitation. Under his mentorship, I rebuilt not just a company, but my entire understanding of what real power actually requires. He taught me that fear might build an empire faster, but only respect keeps one standing after the man who built it disappears. He rarely raised his voice in the 10 months I worked closely beneath him before earning greater independence. He never needed to. When Salvatore Marchetti spoke, contractors listened, city officials listened, competitors listened, not because they feared what he might do to them directly, but because 30 years of consistent follow-through had made his word carry more weight than most binding contracts. I want to tell you about a specific test I faced about 8 months into the role, because a story like this means nothing without a real moment attached to prove it. A rival developer, someone who had lost a significant bid to our division months earlier, approached me privately outside a city council meeting and offered me an enormous personal payment, delivered quietly, in cash, in exchange for inside information about our upcoming land acquisitions before they became public record. He assumed, reasonably enough given the industry's reputation, that anyone working under Marchetti's empire had already made peace with exactly this kind of arrangement. I told him no, calmly, the same way I imagined Salvatore himself might have handled it. I told him that anything I knew about our upcoming project stayed inside our walls, full stop, no exceptions, no matter what number he attached to the offer. Then I told Salvatore about the encounter directly, the same day it happened, because I had learned by then that hiding information, any information, was the exact mistake that had once cost me everything with Elena. Salvatore's response taught me something I still carry with me. He didn't celebrate my loyalty as though it were some rare, extraordinary achievement. He simply nodded and said, "Good. That's what I expected from you." The moment I have to celebrate ordinary honesty is the moment I've hired the wrong kind of man. That single sentence reframed something important for me. Integrity isn't supposed to be exceptional. It's supposed to be the baseline, and the fact that so many people treat basic honesty as impressive says far more about how low the bar has fallen than it says about the person clearing it. Think about this for a moment, because it applies well beyond construction, well beyond any single industry. Most people never realize that the biggest test of their character rarely arrives as a dramatic, obvious moral crisis. It arrives quietly, in a parking lot, in an empty office, in a moment nobody else will ever know about unless you choose to tell them. The choice you make in that silence, when no one is watching and nothing forces your hand, reveals more about who you actually are than every public decision you'll ever make combined. By month 12 under Marchetti's empire, my division had completed 3 major commercial developments that dwarfed anything I had built alone across 14 years running my own company. My compensation had grown into something I genuinely never imagined possible for myself. And somewhere in the middle of that transformation, something else had shifted just as dramatically. Something that had nothing to do with money at all. I had stopped needing anyone's approval to know my own worth. That shift mattered more than any of the financial details, because it directly connects to the second half of this story, the part involving Elena and Victor that I haven't fully told you yet. 6 weeks after Elena's betrayal, before Salvatore had even entered the picture, Victor's scheme began unraveling in a way neither of them had planned for. The shell corporation they'd used to receive the wired funds triggered an automatic federal reporting requirement, the kind designed specifically to catch unusually large transfers moving through newly formed entities with no operating history. Victor, it turned out, was far better at exploiting corporate accounting loopholes than he was at avoiding the very regulatory systems built to catch exactly that kind of exploitation. I want to be honest with you about something, because this part of the story surprised even me when it happened. I found out about the federal inquiry not from investigators, but from Elena herself, calling me nearly 2 months after she'd left, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since the early years of our marriage, back when her fears still sounded human rather than calculated. She told me Victor had already fled the country using funds from an account she didn't have access to, leaving her alone to face federal investigators asking pointed questions about wire transfers she had personally authorized. She asked me, of all things, for help, for legal advice, for anything. I want you to sit with the strange, uncomfortable complexity of that moment with me, because real life rarely offers the clean, satisfying justice that revenge stories usually promise. Part of me, a part I'm not proud of but won't pretend didn't exist, felt something close to satisfaction hearing her voice break the way mine had broken the day I found her at my desk. But a larger part of me felt something closer to a strange, hollow sadness, because whatever cruelty she had shown me, watching someone you once loved completely collapse under the weight of their own choices never actually feels the way you imagined it would feel from the outside. I didn't help her. Not in the way she was asking. I told her, honestly, that I couldn't provide legal advice, that any conversation between us could complicate an active federal investigation, and that she needed her own attorney, someone with no connection to me or to the money she'd taken. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the truth, delivered without the anger I might have delivered it with 2 months earlier. There was one more conversation between us, months later, after her plea agreement had already been finalized, a conversation I agreed to only because her attorney requested it, as part of a broader settlement discussion regarding what little remained of the stolen funds. We met in a small conference room, a lawyer on each side, the kind of sterile, fluorescent-lit room that strips every ounce of romance out of even the most dramatic human moments. She looked smaller than I remembered her, not physically, but in some harder-to-name way, the way people look when the story they built about themselves has finally collapsed under its own weight. She asked me one question before the meeting ended, a question I've thought about often since. She asked if I could ever have forgiven her, if Victor hadn't disappeared, if the two of them had simply gotten away with it entirely. I told her the truth, because there was no reason left to soften anything between us. I told her forgiveness was never really about whether she got caught. It was about whether she would have ever told me herself, unprompted, simply because staying married to me built on that kind of lie had become impossible for her to live with. She didn't answer that question. I think, somewhere underneath everything else, she already knew what her silence meant. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable, because this story would be incomplete without it. Watching Elena's life unravel didn't bring me the closure I expected it to bring. I thought, somewhere in the earliest weeks after discovering what she'd done, that seeing her face real consequences would finally deliver some clean, satisfying sense of justice. It didn't work that way. Justice, when it actually arrives, rarely feels like the movies promise it will feel. It felt, mostly, like watching two people who once mattered deeply to me slowly become strangers, consequences and all, with nothing left underneath the wreckage except the quiet relief of finally understanding the truth completely. She was eventually charged with wire fraud and conspiracy, facing a plea agreement that ultimately kept her out of significant prison time in exchange for full cooperation identifying Victor's location overseas and returning what remained of the stolen funds, a fraction of the original $840,000, most of which Victor had already spent or hidden beyond reasonable recovery. I never asked to be repaid personally. By the time the case resolved, roughly 18 months after that Friday afternoon in my home office, Salvatore's empire had already made the original loss functionally irrelevant to my life. What mattered far more than the money was something I hadn't expected to receive from any of it. Clarity. Here is the biggest lesson from everything you've heard so far, the one I want you to genuinely carry with you, whether or not you ever face a betrayal quite this dramatic. The people who take the most from you rarely see themselves as villains while they're doing it. Elena didn't wake up one morning deciding to destroy me. She built, slowly, over months, an entire internal narrative where taking that money was practical, responsible, even righteous, protecting value from a husband too naive to see collapse coming. Betrayal at this level almost never announces itself as betrayal, even to the person committing it. It disguises itself as self-preservation, as practicality, as simply taking what someone else was too foolish to protect. And here is the second lesson, one that matters just as much. The worst moment of your life, the moment that feels like total, permanent collapse, is very rarely the actual end of your story. It is, more often, the exact moment that reveals who was actually standing beside you all along, and who was only ever standing beside your money, your comfort, or your usefulness to them. Before we get to how this story ends, I want to leave you with something practical, because a story like this means very little if it doesn't leave you with something you can actually use in your own life. If you share finances with someone, a spouse, a business partner, anyone with access to significant resources, build structural safeguards now, while trust feels strong, not later, once suspicion has already crept in. Require dual authorization on anything above a threshold that would genuinely hurt to lose. It isn't an insult to the relationship. It's simply architecture, the same kind of architecture Salvatore built into every corner of his empire long before he ever needed it. Second, pay attention to the quiet alarm bells, the ones that feel too small, too inconvenient, too disruptive to investigate. Most people who get betrayed at this scale can look back afterward and find at least one moment. One phone left face down, one unexplained trip, one small inconsistency, that their instincts flagged long before their conscious mind was willing to accept it. You don't need proof to ask a direct question. You only need the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable answer if one arrives. And third, understand that rebuilding after a betrayal like this is rarely about revenge, and it is almost never as clean or satisfying as you imagine it will be while you're still in the middle of the wreckage. The real rebuilding happens quietly, in the discipline of showing up every single day afterward, proving to yourself, not to the person who betrayed you, that you are still capable of building something real. That proof, more than any courtroom outcome, more than any apology you may or may not ever receive, is the only justice that actually lasts. 2 years after that night in the empty restaurant, Salvatore called me into his office for a conversation that would become the final major turn in this story. He told me, calmly, the way he told me everything, that he was beginning to plan for succession across several divisions of his empire, and that he wanted me to take full, independent ownership of the entire construction and development arm, completely separated from any other part of his business, structured as its own standalone company with no remaining ties to anything beyond legitimate commercial development. Why me? I asked him, the same question I'd asked in that restaurant 2 years earlier, though this time I asked it with the quiet confidence of a man who had genuinely earned the answer coming his way. Because you're the only man I've ever brought close to this empire, he said, who never once asked me for more than what I offered, never once tried to peer behind the wall I built between what's legitimate and what isn't, and never once led a single test, and there were more tests than you probably realized, change who you actually were underneath them. A man like that doesn't need to inherit an empire built on fear. He deserves to build his own kingdom, on a foundation strong enough to survive without me standing behind it. 6 months later, I signed the paperwork making me full, independent owner of what had grown into one of the largest privately held commercial construction firms in the region, employing over 300 people, completely separate, completely legitimate, completely mine in a way my original company, vulnerable to a single signature and a single betrayal, had never truly been. Salvatore Marchetti stepped back from public involvement in his broader empire not long after, for reasons I've chosen not to speculate about publicly, and reasons I suspect I'll never fully know. I don't ask questions I don't need answers to. That lesson, more than any other, is the one his mentorship left permanently stamped into how I approach everything now. I never remarried, though I've built a life I'm genuinely proud of, one built on foundations I inspect far more carefully than I ever did 14 years ago, back when trust felt like something you simply extended freely and never had to verify. So here is the final, biggest lesson from everything you've just heard, the one I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. Money can be stolen in an afternoon. Trust can be shattered in a single sentence. But character, real character, the kind revealed only in the moments nobody forces you to prove it, that is the one thing no betrayal, no matter how devastating, can ever actually take from you. Elena took $840,000 from me in one signature. What she couldn't take, what she never even understood existed in the first place, was the version of me capable of building something far larger than what she stole, the moment everything comfortable was finally stripped away. What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world took everything you'd built and left you with almost nothing, and somewhere in the wreckage, a stranger offered you a path forward that demanded nothing except honesty about exactly who you were? I hope, whatever your answer is, you give yourself the chance to find out, because the lowest number in your bank account has never once been the true measure of your actual worth. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about betrayal, about trust, about the strange, unpredictable ways, our darkest moments sometimes reveal exactly what we're capable of building next. Do something for me right now. Hit that like button, because it genuinely helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear them tonight. Subscribe if you want more real stories about betrayal, resilience, and the hidden lessons buried inside our lowest moments. And leave a comment below telling me about a time someone you trusted completely showed you exactly who they really were, because I read every single one, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Thank you for staying until the very end. Most people don't make it this far, but you did, and that tells me something important about you. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.